sure many of you are familiar what's going on with Sakura from the Seraphim right now. Personally, it's gotten me thinking a lot about what is the role of a member in a group. Obviously, a lot of groups have official positions, and that's great, but I think that there is also just a role of a group member as like a sort of padding to the group, because I mean, why has this not happened sooner? Sakura was an idol in Japan. Sakura was in Eyes One. She was in Produce 48, where everyone loved her and thought that she deserved to be in the final group. They recognized they watched her perform and they didn't say, oh no, this is not someone who's fit for a group. They voted for her enough for her to get into the group, as far as we know. I know there was the rigging, but I do believe that she would have probably gotten in the group regardless of the rigging scandal. And it kind of also makes me think about Kepler, with shouting. I was saying before that I don't think she presents strong enough in any specific talent for her to function as like a solo artist, but I do think that she is someone who just functions well in a group. She is this sort of padding, like when the Girls Planet finale was going on, people were not like, why would shouting make the group? They were like, are they actually going to make this group without shouting? Is she not going to make it? Like, that's crazy. That was the perspective people had. And it's interesting because, Chaehyun won, and people were like, but we don't want her as a center. They didn't want her as a center like they wanted Wonyoung as a center, and Wonyoungism is such a big thing right now. I mean, I loved using that as a term. I'm not gonna lie, I think that that's just so fun. But why is Wonyoung the most popular idol right now, also the most hated right now? Maybe not right now, maybe Karina right now, but why did Wonyoung make such a good center is a good question to ask. And I think it's kind of where I want to focus the discussion. Not necessarily what a center is, but what is the need for a center? I think that is a question that we very much can ask and answer. So we have to talk about psychology on this channel. Did I forget? No, maybe a little bit. When we talk about Eastern cultures and psychology, we immediately have to talk about collectivism. Western cultures tend to be more individualistic. We think of ourselves as individuals first and foremost. In Eastern cultures, that's not really as much the case. People tend to frame their thoughts in terms of like group membership, group roles, group positions, things like that, which I think is part of why groups are such a big thing in K-pop. Now, when I was in psychology classes, the range was 2 to 7, but I've seen some people say 5 to 9. I'm not entirely sure which is like the standard right now, but from what I understand, people tend to be able to keep 2 to 7 items in their mind, in their short-term memory at a time. So obviously some groups that they fit in that range. Other groups like Eyes One, they do not fit in that range. So in order to learn members, we have to do something called, or we tend to do something called chunking. We learn things in smaller chunks, and that makes them more manageable. We also just tend to test ourselves a lot. The testing effect is a good way to learn things as we go along. I definitely think that having a center who is very easily recognizable affects your ability to chunk and test yourself. It makes it that much easier. You have that much more confidence. At least you'll get this one person who you recognize, and they can kind of act as a schema. Your schema is a mental representation of something. It also acts as a mental shortcut. So having someone like Wonyoung could be your mental shortcut in terms of thinking of Eyes One or IVE as a whole. You also need to keep in mind that you learn things in context. When I was taking psychology classes, oh my god, this came up in almost every single class. This one experiment where people were taught vocabulary either on land or underwater, and their performance on the test depended on if they were tested in the same place that they were taught. So even if you were taught underwater, you should take the test underwater, because that will help you remember better. You will not perform as well if you are tested on land, which is the most random study, but it comes up all the time, I promise. There's also just the idea of misinterpreting adrenaline. I think when you have all of these like 12 member groups, for example, there's a lot going on. There's kind of a sort of adrenaline as you watch them and try to understand what's happening. And there is a study where people were like, men had to cross a bridge. It was either very secure, it was less secure, more like swinging about, and at the end they were given the number of a woman, and the idea was that if they were on the less secure bridge, they had this sense of adrenaline, they were more likely to misinterpret that adrenaline as attraction toward the woman, which was kind of measured by like who ended up calling the woman, having felt what they thought was interest in her. So so when you have all of those members doing something so coordinated, it makes sense to like focus in on one person, and usually that person will be the center. Also, when you have a center, there's the idea of mere exposure. As you become more familiar with someone, you tend to like them more. That's usually the case. Mere exposure, you come across something, it becomes familiar, you like it more and more as you go along. Part of this is kind of like the reconsolidation of memories. When you think about something, your brain fires off something called an action potential, and there's this synaptic connection in your brain that either gets formed or gets stronger whenever you think about it. And it's actually the case that every time you think about something, your memory of it, that synaptic connection in your mind, changes physically at least a little bit. So any memory you ever have, it is never going to be the same. Ever. It's always changing physically in your brain. But also when you have those synaptic connections, when the axon fires, those synaptic connections get stronger, you're going to think about it more. You're going to become more familiar with it. You're going to have the mere exposure effect. You are going to like this person so much. Also, I think that having someone like Wonyoung who isn't necessarily the strongest in terms of specific skills, I think that is a good way to convince people that there is no social loafing going on, because people tend to understand that the center is not the main vocalist, the center is not the main dancer or the main rapper. Like, they don't tend to be the strongest in one specific skill. So if you have someone who is really good at just selling the idea of being an idol, and you have them, if you have that person front and center, you get the idea that, okay, the center isn't bad, so everyone else must be just like that much better. There's no social loafing going on. Social loafing is when you're put in a group of people and you don't perform as well because you just kind of assume that the group as a collective can kind of pick up your slack. I also think this kind of plays into how idols and groups will just like play it safe in their performances nowadays, because there are a lot of different types of information that your brain can process. There's iconic information, which is visual. There's also echoic information, which is auditory. And I think that having a performance that is nearly the same, it's going to fire that specific connection in your brain that many more times and make that specific connection super strong, rather than if things were kind of different, then it might take form literally in your brain. It might take form differently. But I also think that idols are not playing it safe in a lot of ways. I think I've had a pretty clear sound that they were going for, and then Baddie, they very much strayed from that image, and I think that that's a very respectable way of going about things. Like, we could just keep doing something very similar and playing off of that, literal psychological strategy, but they decided that they wanted it to be more than one thing, and that is something that I definitely really respect about them. Is that to say we've lost the need for things like centers and signature sounds? Absolutely not, but I think that this is a good direction that we are going in. It's also one that I'll be interested in following the dynamics of.
Everyone